everybody, my toy bonsai Boise. This is my FIcus fusion. It suffered a setback recently, but before we get into that, we'll go back in time and I'll show you some of the progress that led up to this point over the past few years. So starting in May of 19, so about 5 years ago, 4.5 or 5 years ago, it was really just a few twigs in a pot. That's all it was. As you can see, you just twisted up and braided some Ficus benjamina cuttings and put them in the pot. And someone had told me back then, electrical tape was a good thing to use because it had a stretchiness to it, which probably on paper sounds like a good idea. In practice, it's not so great because when you pull that electrical tape off of Ficus benjamina, it rips a lot of the bark off. Luckily, it didn't kill it, but made it a little ugly for a while. So there it was after I wrapped it up. Here it was about 1.5 years later. As you can see, it just tears some of the bark right off of there. And the bark on a Ficus benjamina is not like an oak or a maple. It's not super tough. It's pretty weak. So it just comes right off with the tape. Learning lesson number 1 in this process. This was my first attempt at using Ficus. I've done quite a few of these since then, but this is still my first one. So not a ton of fusion yet. Here it is in June of 21. You can just start to see a little bit of fusion happening there. And for the most part, my strategy with this fusion project had just been to let it grow wild, then trim it back, let it grow wild, trim it back. So I switched to this green gardening tape, thinking, okay, that's what it's for. But it had a different problem. The green tape sort of fused in with the bark. I don't know if I just got a bad batch of tape or what, because most people have said, that never happens to me. So I don't know, it happened to me. So I spent a little time scrubbing it clean. Again, not fatal or anything, just sort of unsightly. Learning lesson number 2. But you can start to see some fusion happening there. So this time I just went with a piece of cloth. The only problem with the cloth is that it gets really ugly. Dirt and water and everything, it just gets really dirty and ugly. But otherwise it worked out fine. Another big learning lesson in this is not to braid the trees together. When you braid the trees together, you get these big air gaps in between, and it takes so much longer for them to fuse. This time I tried a different strategy. I used rubber bands and sticks, and you'll see how. Wrap it up with rubber bands. And a stick. And this worked well enough. I don't know if I would do it again, but it worked well enough. It was easy. And then as the rubber bands dried out, if they broke or something, it was easy to just replace it. But it's still kind of ugly. The biggest learning lesson in all of this is not to let it get out of shape like this. So November 22, at this point going on about 3.5 years since I originally started it. My thought process behind letting it grow out was you let it grow out, that thickens the trunk. As the trunk thickens, it fuses together, which is all true. But it's really hard getting them back into shape, and I've been sort of wrestling with that ever since. You see a few aerial roots this time. I tried my clear plastic bag trick where I just put a plastic bag over it, and that creates humidity, kind of a mini greenhouse effect, and aerial roots. I was super happy. I never had anything with aerial roots like this, so you'll see where that becomes a problem later. So a little more fusion happening. At this point, I switched to Teflon tape, which I've been using ever since. It doesn't stick to the tree, it doesn't fuse with the tree, it's cheap, it's easy. It's definitely what I recommend. Here it is, this recent September of 23. I was really happy with the progress. It was good and healthy. It was fusing together all over the place. What I didn't like is how close together those branches were. They're kind of parallel with each other. So I was really excited and anxious to see how the fusion was going. And there it is. So you can see fusion is happening. Although because of some of the setbacks that I've had, it's taking a little longer than maybe I should. If you want a great example of ficus fusion, check out Back Garden Bonsai. He's got a great example of one, and his is so much better than mine. We started about the same time too, I think. But his fused together perfect. And one of the biggest differences is that he didn't braid the trees together. He just lined them all straight up together. So definitely recommend checking out his channel and checking out his playlist on his ficus fusions. So before I move on from September's work, one thing I wanted to do was just separate these branches a bit. So I can wire them, but I do this thing kind of like a wedge, where I just create a wedge and stick it in there and it holds them apart. It's a relatively easy way to get some movement if you don't need anything too fancy. And that's all you do right there. So there it was in September of 23. I decided not to even wrap it back up. It was fusing together well enough. Brings us back to present day, January of 24. So it's been suffering a little bit, and I didn't really realize how much until I pulled it out. It was kind of all the way in the back of my grow tent. And I didn't really notice what was going on, but there's some problem here. I think it's the soil. The soil has this like greenish, whitish mildew, which is a bad sign. I did some research, and I think it's called powdery mildew, which they say is harmless, which I believe it probably is, but I also think it's an indication of some other big problems. Because I've experienced it in a few trees, and it's never killed anything, but it's always an indication that something else is going on. So the first thing I wanted to do was just sort of trim this up, get rid of any dead branches and leaves and sticks. And then something occurred to me. See, those are aerial roots. I decided to get rid of those. It seems obvious to me now, but at the time, it just didn't occur to me that aerial roots were actually taking away from the trunk. Because that energy is just going up the aerial root into the upper branches and just bypassing the trunk altogether. So I decided to repot it. Not the best time of year to do it, and I prefer not to do it when they're kind of suffering like this, but there's something going on, and I think it's something to do with the soil. So I just decided to do it. The first thing I noticed as I started digging in there is that this soil is just bone dry, which is not something I typically do. If anything, I overwater trees. But in my grow tent, if you've seen any of my videos on that, I've got this sprayer, and I spray all the trees down, and I try to get it into the pot as best I can. Some of the ones in the back, can be neglected a little bit. And I think that's what happened here. So when it's in a humid environment and it's not getting watered as well as it should, stuff like this can happen. So word to the wise, keep an eye on your trees in the back. So there it is after I get all the old soil out and I chop off the bottom half of the root ball. The roots look good. I mean, I'm not concerned with that. They look alive. They're not all black and rotted and dead. So I just make a few basic sort of common sense type cuts, get rid of the ones going straight down or going the wrong direction. But I want to keep a good amount of roots here. Ficuses can take kind of a beating on this, at least in my experience, if done at the right time. And that's sort of the catch here. This isn't the great time to do it. So I use the same pot. This is not a bonsai pot. It's just a big, deep pot that I'm using for now as I'm trying to encourage growth and fusion. That's my normal soil mix: pine bark, perlite, safety absorb, and some volcanic rock. So I let the roots marinate in a bucket of water there for a while. And the more I looked at these aerial roots, the more I didn't like them. It was always sort of imbalanced. I got like 7 or 8 giant aerial roots on one side and one little one on the other, and it just looked weird. So I decided to get rid of most of them. I keep one on one side and one on the other. It looks more balanced this way, and also it's going to channel more energy up the trunk, which is what I want. I get kind of nitpicky with the roots here for a minute. I finally get satisfied with how it is. Put in new soil. Get the aerial roots sort of situated. I chose to keep that one on the right side just because it kind of split off into a few, and I thought it looked cool that way. It's more interesting looking like that than it is having just one long straight aerial root going straight down. I do have other problems to deal with on this tree later, once it regains its health. Ultimately, I want to bring down the height, maybe 1/4 to 1/3. And also just some of the structure is wrong. I let it go too long just trying to encourage growth, and I should have paid more attention, to the normal things that I do on every other tree. I kind of thought that I could fix it later, and I will, but I still regret it. I should have dealt with that a little bit more. You'll see some kind of goofy features on this here in a minute. Gave it a good soak. So there it is after I'm done doing the repot. I worked the soil into the roots, watered it real well. Actually brought it downstairs to the sink and really gave it a good thorough soak. I'll show you some of these structural flaws in here. Some of them you might call features. Some are pretty obvious flaws. Overall, like I said, I want to bring the height down. It's a little flimsy in there, so Put a couple stabilizing rocks. I'm going to bring the height down and just fix some of these branching issues. Too long and straight in too many places. I know I sound very critical of this tree, but having it 5 years and having it look like this, I wish I just would have paid more attention to some of those basic things. A lot of branches growing in the wrong direction. But this is not the time for big structural changes. Right now is the time just to get it healthy again. You might notice one really uniquely weird feature right there. I call it the Eye of Sauron. Gosh, I'm such a nerd. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you'll get it. But that's what it is. It's just the way the branches fused together. It just created that big hole. So I'm definitely going to have to fix that later. But for now, that's it. Had to correct some setbacks, get repotted into new soil, fix some of those wiring wedges, get rid of dead branches, get rid of some of those aerial roots to try and channel energy back up the trunk. And I'll put it back in the grow tent. We'll see how it goes. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Have a good rest of your day.